Hi, my name is Jenny Matz, and it's September 9th, 2011, and I'm very happy to be conducting an interview with Vince Gilligan today for the Archive of American Television in Burbank, California. Vince, thanks so much again for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course, and we're just going to take a few minutes to talk about your beginning. So could you tell us what your name was at birth?
My name at birth is George Vincent Gilligan Jr. I'm a junior. My dad is George Sr. And to avoid confusion, at home with having two Georges in the house, I got very quickly, my family started calling me Vince, and it's stuck. So I go by Vince. Yeah.
And your parents, so your dad, we know his name. What was your mom's name, and what did they do?
My mom's name was Gail Gilligan. Gail Lambert Gilligan. Lambert was her maiden name. And my mom is a retired, at this point, a retired school teacher. She taught elementary school, and she taught reading. She was a reading specialist in a lot of different places, but primarily Farmville, Virginia, where I spent a lot of my younger years, and Chesterfield County, Virginia, outside of Richmond. And my dad is a retired insurance claims adjuster who worked for a lot of companies like Travelers and Dairyland and Virginia Mutual, and was the guy who paid out the claims when people bang their cars up and stuff like that.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Richmond, Virginia, in February 10th, 1967, at MCV Hospital, and I lived in Richmond, the capital of Virginia. Lived in Richmond for the first couple of years of my life, and then my dad got moved. I think he was working for Travelers at the time. Got moved from Richmond to Farmville, Virginia, which is about 65 miles west of Richmond. And so, from about the time I was probably 3 or 4 years old, 2 or 3 years old, till about the time I was 13 or 14, lived in Farmville for about for about 10 years, 10 or 11 years of my life there in the early going.
And then you went to high school where?
Went to high school, had 1 year at a wonderful art school in Michigan, a boarding school called Interlochen Arts Academy, which was great. And I studied metalsmithing and visual arts, although it's mostly a music and performance school. And that was a great place to go, but money was a little tight, and didn't get to go back after, only got 1 year there. But 1 year was nice to get a taste of that. Mostly went to high school in Chesterfield County, Virginia, at Lloyd C. Bird High School, which is a wonderful school right there by the courthouse. And so I finished up the last 3 years of high school there.
Did you continue a hobby in metalsmithing?
I took a welding course after college. I moved back to Virginia after college and went to the adult ed center, which was right next to the high school I used to go to, and took welding and arc welding and cutting with an oxyacetylene torch. And nobody warned me the first day in the class. No one said to wear long sleeves, and I didn't realize, the arc welder puts out this amazing ultraviolet energy. And I got home that night with the worst sunburn I'd ever had on my arms, because you're wearing a welding mask and all that, but my arms were bare, and it was like, oh my God, this hurts. So
was that the end of the
No, I stuck with it. I don't weld worth a damn, but if the world depended on it, I could maybe stick two pieces of metal together. But I know how to cut steel pretty good. I got pretty good with the cutting, not so good with the welding.
I'll keep that in mind. And what were your interests growing up? I mean, did you have an early interest in writing, or?
I had an early interest in the movies. I loved movies, and of course back then we only had three, if we're lucky, 4 channels of TV. 3 channels, ABC, CBS, NBC, and then we had the PBS station out of Richmond, and we had this antenna on the roof that you'd turn this dial down in the basement by the TV, and you hear it go click, 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 and it turn the antenna around and face Richmond, 60 miles away, and try to tune in the weaker stations. But watching old movies on late night movies with my dad and my mom, and my dad being a big movie fan, and my grandfather, my dad's father, being a very big movie fan, and hearing them talk about favorite movie actors like Humphrey Bogart and Jimmy Cagney and all these great movies that these guys used to be in, probably got me interested from an early age. And I was very lucky in that I went to a wonderful elementary school that no longer exists in Farmville. It was called the J.P. Wynn Campus School, and it was this building shaped like a flying saucer. It was a part of Longwood College, which is, Farmville's a college town, and it was the lab school for the college, and my mom taught there. And it was this amazing school that was it seemed to me ahead of its time, even now looking back. It was art and music, and were a big part of the curriculum. And all the teachers were great, and everybody was very enthusiastic to be there. And all of this long-winded way of saying, I think the J.P. Wynn Campus School that I went to all through elementary school was a big part of why I do what I do today, because from an early age I was interested in movies and in television, and both. I watched an inordinate amount of both. And I had an art teacher at this campus school named Jackie Wall, who was this wonderful lady, and who was very enthusiastic about art and about inculcating, if I'm using that word right, interest in art and creativity into her students. And she owned a Super 8 film camera that she would let me borrow every summer during school breaks, and I would basically have possession of her Super 8 UMIG camera. I think that was a brand name. And I would make these little movies in my basement and in the backyard every summer, and then cut them together when the school year started up. And it was, just had such a good time doing that. And it really, in a lot of ways, got me my start in putting things on film and having that as a career. And she passed away a few years ago. She was a wonderful teacher, wonderful lady. And her son now, Angus Wall, just won the Oscar last year for editing The Social Network. So the two of us, Angus Wall and me, coming out of tiny little Farmville, Virginia, which at the time that I was living there had about 3,000 or 4,000 residents, is kind of interesting. And I think a lot of it, a lion's share of that, a lot of that comes down to Mrs. Wall being such a wonderful, positive, inspiration on her son and on me. So.
Well, that laid a strong groundwork, I guess. Yeah.
It laid a strong, it held me in good stead for many, many years now. That all the things she taught me and made me enthusiastic, helped me become enthusiastic about.
So now, this love of movie making, is that what propelled you to go to NYU and to the Tisch School for college?
I was lucky that I always kind of knew what I wanted to do. Way back when, I wanted to be like an astronaut, and then I kind of quickly figured out that I did not have a brain for science and mathematics. Oddly enough, with Breaking Bad, but and what it centers on. But I that was way back. Pretty much since about the time of third grade, I kind of knew I wanted to be in the movie business. And I mean, and that was sort of a catch-all idea in my mind. Movies, television, of course, back in Farmville, Virginia in the mid-'70s, it's all one and the same. It's all, you don't have an understanding as a kid back in the mid-'70s in the middle of rural Virginia what all of this life entails. You just figure you can flow back and forth between the two. And of course, the reality is somewhat different. But anyway, I always was interested in doing this for a living, and wound up going to NYU Film School because of that interest, and going undergrad about 1985 to 89. I was at NYU at the Tisch School, and that was a great experience. It was great mainly, it was a great school, but it was mainly great for me because it was mind-blowing to move from a small town in Virginia to New York City, live in Manhattan. And that was culture shock to the nth degree, but wonderful and necessary for me because I was pretty sheltered. I had a very nice, happy childhood, but it was kind of a kind of a small world that I lived in. So, moving into a bigger world was scary and exciting, and I'm glad I went to NYU.
At what point did you write the screenplay, Home Fries, that you then submitted to the Virginia Governor's Screenwriting Competition? Was at the end of your college years?
I wrote the screenplay. I had this great screenwriting professor named Jesse Kornbluth, who was a writer. I think still writes for Vanity Fair and a lot of the big magazines. I think he's still around. I think he has a very interesting blog he does on politics and the culture. I hate to say I've kind of lost track of Jesse, but he was a great teacher, great professor at NYU, and he taught screenplay writing. I can't remember the exact title of the class, but it was basically a screenwriting class. And he was a very enthusiastic, very interesting, colorful guy, who I think kind of got Chris Columbus, his first agent. And that was the big news around campus was Chris Columbus took Jesse's class, and Jesse liked his writing so much that he introduced him to an agent. And that's indeed what happened for me. Jesse liked the script I wrote for his class. It was senior thesis writing class. I wrote Home Fries. It was my first screenplay. And that was like 1987, I guess. And I wrote Home Fries. Jesse liked it and sent it to his friend Rhonda Gomez, who at the time was an agent at Triad Artists. Triad no longer exists. It got bought up by Broder Kurland, and then Broder now doesn't exist. It got bought up by ICM. But Rhonda Gomez therefore became my first agent in the business, and because of Jesse Kornbluth giving her my script, and that was a wonderful leg up that he gave me, that he allowed me there. So hats off to and big thanks to Jesse. And that was, and then shortly, not too long after, that was about, I met Rhonda probably 87 or 88. I first started talking to her. It was like 89. It all runs together all these years later. But
and you're still living in Manhattan?
I graduated, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't 87. That was too long ago. I think I wrote Home Fries.
It was 87.
It was?
I think so. 88, yeah.
Maybe 88. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I graduated NYU in 89. I lived in Manhattan through most of 1990. And but luckily in 89, yeah, I guess you're right. It was about 87 or 88. Because in 89, I won the Governor's Screenwriting Competition. I was one of three winners, unranked. Three of us won that year, and I entered Home Fries into that competition, and luckily won. But this was something called the Governor's Screenwriting Competition in Virginia, and it was created about '88. Virginia created this film festival, and it takes place to this day at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and it is this really nice thing that exists in part when it first was created to help get more film production in Virginia. But long story short, this contest that I won in '89 back in my home state with Home Fries sort of is the one moment, I guess, that sort of launched me into having a professional career, if I had to pin one down, because one of the judges of the contest that year was Mark Johnson, who had recently produced and won the Oscar for Rain Man, and was Barry Levinson's producing partner at the time, and had done Diner and all these big movies. And he liked the script enough that he called me. I think I won the contest in like October of '89, and he called me around December of that year and said, "I really like that script. Do you have any others?" And I jumped on that opportunity. Luckily, I had a couple others. At that point, I had a couple other feature scripts that I'd written since Home Fries. And I sent them along, and he liked them, and we have been working together on and off, but mostly on ever since. He's really my mentor in the business, if you will. He's just been a great influence on me, and a great. I'm just lucky to have him in my life. He's a great guy, and an excellent producer, and knows everybody. I had my mind blown a bunch of times in the early going when I'd come out here to Los Angeles to visit when I was still living in Virginia, and Mark would take me to some party at like Carrie Fisher's house, or he'd introduce me to Quincy Jones, or he'd introduce me to, oh man, a lot of interesting people. So, because he knows everybody.
Did he give you any advice when you were starting out about career-wise, just what steps you should take?
Mark Johnson gave me some, what at the time I thought was very good advice, and I think it was good advice, and I did abide by it for 4 or 5 years, and that advice was to not move out to Los Angeles. Mark Johnson was pretty adamant. He said, "You like it in Virginia, obviously. You very much see yourself as a, Southern guy. Who, you moved from Manhattan back home to Virginia, which I had done at that point. You see yourself very much belonging in this region of the country." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, it shows in your writing. I think you ought to stay there, and we'll bring you out for meetings and whatnot. But I think if you move out here, you'll just become kind of a Hollywood asshole." So, like everybody else does. And he said it with a smile. He was joking. And of course, not everybody, not by a damn sight, is everyone out here an asshole. But he was sort of trying to make his point. And I abided by that for the longest time because it made sense to me. His point was that whatever uniqueness I had to my voice, in my writing, whatever uniqueness I had as a writer, was in large part born of the region of the country I was living in and how it defined me, and being a Southerner, whereas he thought at the time, folks who move out here are all going to try to chase, read Variety and the Hollywood Reporter and see what the hot new theme is to write about, and voices become homogenized. I don't know that that's true, but that was his thinking at the time, and I bought into it, and it made a lot of sense to me, and on some level perhaps still does. And because of that, I lived in Virginia as a working professional screenwriter. I lived in Virginia from moved back to Virginia about late 1990, lived there till about 1995 when I finally, had lost my insurance and things had sort of dried up work-wise, and because of me, because I was real lazy. I was like, playing video games and not writing much and not having much in the way of self-discipline. So about 5 years of living in Virginia, trying to maintain the uniqueness of my voice, wound up not accomplishing a whole lot. And then I moved out in about 95 to Los Angeles for the job on the X-Files.
And we're going to get to that in a second. I just want to comment, though, that I think he had good advice for you because a lot of the unique colloquialisms and the sort of regional dialect, it shows up in the X-Files and in Breaking Bad. So,
well, thank you.
But and I don't know how many Hollywood writers say "not by a damn sight." So I enjoy that. I appreciate that. So.
Well, it was good advice, and the downside to the advice, which has nothing to do with Mark and his advice, the downside was it rests on me. The responsibility rests on me. But living in Virginia, the first option I ever got on a screenplay was the first option money I ever got had significantly more zeros in it than I'd ever seen. It was modest by what we consider today. It was not the kind of money I was getting for optioning stuff in the early days. Was you'd get a check for $20,000 or $40,000 or something, which is a wonderful check to get if you've never gotten a check like that in your life. It was fantastic. It was nothing that would even make the papers today, but at the time, living in Virginia, I'd get a check, like manna from heaven. I'd get this check, and you've never seen your family. No one in your family, has ever. The only time you've ever seen a check like that is maybe, when you buy a house or something, and the mortgage company cuts it to the, whatever, and you get to hold it in your hand for 2 seconds before, you finish signing all the paperwork or whatever. But it kind of turned my head a little bit living back there in Virginia when the money started coming in. What's my point? I had a point. My point is that living in Virginia and not having someone actively cracking the whip on me, not that it was anyone's responsibility or job to do that, and feeling like, oh my God, I've died and gone to heaven. I've got this kind of checks coming in, and I got really lazy. That's my point. The point I'm trying to make is, it was good advice on Mark's part to not move out at that time. Although actually I haven't been here now for 15, 16 years. I like it out here. Can't beat the weather, that's for sure. But the best thing about it is being surrounded by folks who, it can be a double-edged sword. It's nice to be surrounded by folks in the same business. It's great to have a writer's room and talk to really smart writers who can help me make my work better. And I was lacking all of that back in Virginia. But again, it's all on me. That's my fault that I was, sleeping 14 hours a day and playing Sega, playing video, Sonic the Hedgehog or whatever the hell I was doing. Just it's wasted like 5 years there. I wish I had it back now.
Wow.
Yeah.
20,000 goes a long way in Virginia, I'm sure.
Yeah,
so you could afford to do that.
It was like, yeah.
What was happening with the Home Fry script, though? Why did it take almost 10 years for that film to come out?
It's a typical situation, I suppose. A lot of good-intentioned people read a script and like it, and, a company buys it. In that case, it was TriStar Pictures, all part of Sony. It's just hard to get a movie going. It's just damn hard. We went through a series of directors who were interested in directing Home Fries, as I've been through a series of directors on pretty much every script I've ever written. Folks kind of dance with it for a while, dally with it, and think about it, and ponder it, and then they move on to something else, and or the financing can't quite come together, or actually that's never been a problem. All of the early scripts I wrote were all owned by a big company, ultimately Sony. So it was a question of getting them interested in a certain star or a certain director. And, the stuff I write, especially in the early going, actually now too, it's kind of, some of it's perhaps kind of an acquired taste. It was, especially the early going stuff was kind of quirky and a little bit off center. And so it's the kind of stuff that would attract directors, but then ultimately scare them off, I think. I got a script called Two-Face I wrote in 1990, which every now and then it pops up in the Reporter or pops up in Variety or something that somebody's going to do it or somebody's interested in doing it, and then it ultimately, and I say, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it, because it's been 21 years now, but it's a comedy about racism. So so it interests people for a while. And then, God, I remember having a meeting with Kevin Costner 18, 19 years ago about him starring in it. It's been a long time. Wow. But, yeah. So Home Fries, it just, some different directors cycled through and were interested for a while and then kind of gave up on it. And then finally, in 1998, Dean Pariseau figured it out and got cast together, and Mark Johnson produced it. And it's a sweet little movie. The ending's not quite right, and that's on me. That's not anybody else's fault. I never really cracked the ending of that movie, and I knew it at the time, but I was busy working on the X-Files at the time, and I couldn't. That was like the rare situation, because the first movie I wrote that got made, the first movie I wrote was Home Fries, but the first thing that got made was this movie called Wilder Napalm, which was a great experience, being a first experience, but I wasn't really allowed on the set as the writer on that one. And irony of ironies, when Home Fries came along, 3 or 4 or 5 years after that, they wanted me desperately on the set. The director, Dean Pariseau, this great guy, wanted me on the set, and I couldn't be there because I was too busy doing X-Files. And he wanted me on the set because he knew the ending wasn't quite right, and I kind of knew it too, and he wanted help with it, and I couldn't give him quite the help that. So anyway, whatever's wrong with that movie is my fault, because it's a sweet little movie and the actors are really good in it.
So now let's talk about you moving to LA to work on X-Files in 1995. So was this a transition for you, television? Had you written for television before?
I had never written for television before, and as I was saying earlier, the years about 1990, 91 through 95, I was living the big life in outside of Richmond, Virginia, living in this little house that I'd bought, my first house in the middle of Powhatan County, Virginia, which is very pretty, but it's a 45 or 50 minute drive from where I was into Richmond. So it was sort of like living permanently in the hotel overlook in the movie The Shining, or the book. It was, especially in the winter. I got snowed in a couple times out there. I was living sort of like Jack Nicholson's character. I was going steadily more insane, living out there all by myself and sleeping, living like a vampire. I'd go to bed I'd wind up going to bed at like, it just crept up till I'd go to sleep at like 5 or 6 in the morning, sleep pretty much all day, and wake up at dusk, and play video games and pretend that I was a writer, although I'd write maybe a paragraph a week or something, and because everything had to be art, everything had to be, Anyway, all of this to say that the 5 years there that I kind of pissed away back in Virginia by being self-indulgent and lazy led me to a point where I was coming to realize, I've lost my Writers Guild insurance. I hadn't had any money coming in for a while. I'm pitching ideas, and suddenly I'm not, selling them as readily as I used to. I got very lucky right out of college. I was kind of a flavor of the month, as it were, when I first graduated at NYU. I get very fortunate because of Jesse Kornbluth's help and Rhonda Gomez's and the help of running this contest. It came a little too easy for me, and which I'm not complaining about. It was wonderful, but because of that, I was kind of lazy in the early going, and didn't feel like I was going to have to pay much in the way of dues. And the dues, I think everybody pays dues. They come earlier, they come late. But all of this to say, I do have a point here I will circle back to eventually, that around 1995, movies were less and less available. The movie business was getting less and less available to me. I was having a harder time selling scripts, getting stuff going. And about that time, actually around about halfway through, about 1993, fall of 1993, this TV show, The X-Files, came on the air. And I'd, roused myself from playing video games, and I'd watch it every Friday night. I watched it from the very first episode on. I remember being at home in 93 when it first came on, and I'd read some blurb about it in the newspaper, and it sounds like it might be worth getting, worth watching, so. And about the first 20 minutes of the show, I was hooked. I was just a stone fan of the X-Files from the first airing on. Something about it, I loved it. I was just enamored of it. And I called my agent, Rhonda Gomez, who I mentioned earlier. At some point or another, we were talking business, talking movie business, which at that point was not amounting to much business. And I said, have you seen this new TV show, The X-Files? It's great. I love it. And she says, it's funny you should mention that. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm the guy who created it. His name is Chris Carter, and I'm related to him by marriage. I am the cousin of his wife, Dory. And yeah, he's a real good guy. I've been to, spent time with him, whatever. This is her talking. And she says, would you like to meet him next time you're out on business? And I said, well, yeah, that'd be fun. I had no interest at the time in joining the staff of the X-Files. I saw myself squarely as a movie writer. And I fell ass backward into meeting this guy, sort of like Kramer on Seinfeld always fell ass backward into good luck. And I had a meeting. Next time I was out in California, I was out there for what I thought was important business. I was pitching some movie idea or another, or trying to get some rewrite job or something. No, actually not a rewrite. I was not big on rewriting. I wanted to do everything original back then. But I was pitching some idea I had that came to nothing ultimately. And before I got on the plane to come back home, we had this little meeting where I go over to Fox Studio, the Fox lot, and I get to meet Chris, who's interested in meeting. I think partly, probably because he was doing his friend or quasi-relative, Rhonda Gomez, he's doing her a favor, partly. But also because he had actually read the script I wrote called Wilder Napalm, and he kind of liked it. So all I thought I was doing was sitting down to meet a guy who at that point was not the Chris Carter. This was in the early going. This was 6 months into the show or whatever, and the show had not attained critical mass yet. And I thought, I'm just going to go meet this guy who writes this show that I think is very cool and shake his hand and tell him great job. I really thought that was all it was about. And at that time, little did I know, they were suffering through their I think they were early going to their second season at that point, and they had an order of 26 episodes that year because the show had actually done pretty well in the first season. So, long story short, they needed a freelance episode to round out their season. So they were looking high and low. They were looking for like anyone who could pull it off, and he had liked the writing of Wilder Napalm, and he said, Chris, as I'm talking with him, says, do you have any ideas for an episode? And like the night before in the hotel room, I had been sitting watching TV, and I noticed my shadow on the wall next to me, and I thought, wouldn't it be creepy if my shadow came to life? It's what kind of dipshit idea, that people have from time to time when their mind is wandering. But I just blurted that out. I said, I don't know. It would be cool if a shadow came to life and started killing people. And he said, like, how? And I said, I don't know. Maybe it's like Darkman. So I was, all of this to say, in my long-winded fashion, that I was not there to get a job. I was there to shake the hand of a guy I really respected. And therefore, I was not nervous, because otherwise I would have been nervous if I was trying to get a job. And I was not selling, but luckily for me, he was buying at that particular moment. And he said, that sounds kind of interesting. Would you want to write that as a spec? And I thought, well, why the hell not? Nothing else much is going on right now. So I went back home to Virginia, and I wrote my first episode of television, my first hour of TV. It was an episode called Soft Light, and it got made very late in season 2 of the X-Files, so I think they're shooting it in late '94. And actually, I flew myself to, bought an airline ticket, flew to Vancouver, watched them shoot. I got Chris's permission, and then I hung out and watched them shoot the episode. David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson were very nice, very pleasant to be around. Everybody, for the most part, thought it was cool. I had gotten myself there to just hang out like a fan. The assistant director in the show was kind of pissed at me for hanging out and talking to the actors in between takes. He, by the way, was Tom Braidwood, who later to be known as Frohickey of the Lone Gunmen. He's one of the 3 Lone Gunmen. He started off as our assistant director in the X-Files, and great guy, but he was pissed off at me the first time I ever met him because I was annoying. I was distracting the actors as far as he was concerned. But I wrote this episode, long story short, too late for that. Long story short, this episode aired, and I really enjoyed seeing it on television. It was a big thrill for me. I got all the family back in Virginia watching it. And after it aired, all right, back to movie business. But then I got a call from Chris Carter, who said, it went pretty well. Would you like to join a writing staff? And I said, writing staffs have to be all in one room, right? And he says, yeah, you'd have to move out to Los Angeles. And I said, oh, man, I'm very flattered. But I've got a house here. My girlfriend's here in Virginia. My girlfriend, Holly, I need to shout out to her. We've been together 20 years. My girlfriend, Holly's back here. I can't move to, no thanks. And I turned it down, and about 6 months went by, and I had this big movie idea I was going to pitch. And I remember pitching this thing to Mark Johnson. It was my attempt at doing a big crowd-pleasing movie, what they would call now a tent pole or something, some big action thing. And I remember pitching it. I was all working it up for months, and I pitched it to Mark Johnson, and he was like, I don't get it. And I was just crushed. And I was like, oh, shit, I put so much work into this thing. Gee, I wonder if that X-Files job is still available. So I called up Chris Carter and kind of meekly said, about 6 months had elapsed. And I said, would you guys still be interested in me joining the staff? I think, because I was at a point, things were looking kind of dire in the film business as relates to me. So I thought, well, what the hell am I sticking around here for? My savings are getting whittled down. I'm living off of them. Getting whittled down every month. I've got no insurance because I have not had any sales to cover the Writers Guild insurance for like a year and a half. What the hell not move out to California? I look back on it and I think how tremendously, ridiculously lucky I was in all of the aspects of meeting Chris Carter, and I'm kind of ashamed now that I was not blasé about it, but I was focused on other things. I was not a snob about television, not at all. never have been, never was, never will be, because I've grown up watching TV and loving it. But I just saw myself as a different. I was just a movie guy, primarily because you could live anywhere being a movie writer, and not so much being a TV writer. And I was not ready to move lock, stock, and barrel from one edge of the continent to the other. So, but luckily, I'm glad I had that bad luck, because that kind of gave me the impetus, gave me the shove to move out here, because that's when my career really started. Technically, I was a professional writer for 5 years, but my career truly, in my mind, didn't start until I moved out here and started writing for television. So.
Now, creatively, can you talk a bit about the difference, about when you were thrust into this writer's room that had already, it was a show in progress, so what were the challenges for you in writing to the voices of characters already established?
I was primarily concerned. I wasn't concerned, I was scared. I was scared about moving out here. I was such a little, even though I'd lived in Manhattan and Brooklyn for 5 years, I was still kind of a wallflower, or kind of sheltered or whatever. I was really nervous about moving out here, because primarily I had heard the X-Files was a tough gig, and that it was a lot of attrition. Most folks in the writer's room did not last that long. There's like a 13-week probation period, and then if you don't, pass muster at the end of that, you're politely, asked to leave, or not picked up, rather. And I was so lazy for so long back in Virginia that I thought, my God, you got to be in these rooms for like 10, 12 hours straight, and you got to hit these intense deadlines and have the script written in a week or whatever. I can't do this shit. I can't. I'm gonna get fired for. I just won't be able to pull this off. I never. It's funny. I should have been thinking more in terms of creativity. Am I going to be able to, as you just said, get the voice of the characters? Am I going to be able to write a good enough script? But I guess I felt like I had that base covered, because they'd asked me to be there, and I had already written a script, that Soft Light episode. But what I was really worried about was having the stamina to work at a TV pace, amongst other TV writers. And so that, scared me. And I moved out, I loaded, but I needed to do it. I needed to make that change. So I loaded up my GMC Jimmy, and I drove out, loaded it. It looked like the Beverly Hillbillies, except, with all the stuff piled up in the car. And drove out by myself and checked into the Oakwood and started up. I think I started up on Chris's birthday, October 13th, 1995. I don't usually remember dates, but his production company is, after all, named 1013 Productions after his birthday. So I remember being there. I think it was his 40th birthday, because there was a big celebration and whatnot. And started up and promptly got mono. Came down with mono. I think I was stressed out. I think it's kind of triggered by stress. I don't know. I may be wrong. I'm no doctor. But all I know is for sure is I had it for like 6 or 8 weeks, and it just kicked me in the butt. And I was, every 2 or 3 days I'd be able to rally enough to come into the office. But I was pretty much out for 6 weeks. And I only found out later how close I came to getting fired, because I think Chris thought I was gold bricking or something, because it was like, where is this guy?
And the other writers must have had questions.
Yeah, but I mean, actually, I think the saving grace was that when I could rally myself enough to come in, everyone said it, looked like hell. It looked like death warmed over. Mono was like, it was the kissing disease. So like, I didn't even get it the fun way. All of a sudden it just hit me, just out of nowhere. Oh, it was miserable. God, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But about 6 weeks of suffering through that, I managed to get an episode written called Pusher. That was my first episode as a staff writer. And I was lucky to have, between being sick and Chris, understandably not being that reliant on a beginning writer. He had his producers who did all the heavy lifting. He and his producers did all the heavy lifting. They knew they needed a slot filled toward the end of that season. So I managed to hit that deadline, that very, very lax and forgiving deadline with this first episode, Pusher, and it came out really well. I was real proud of it, and I was sort of off and running from that point on. Once I got over the mono.
So can you talk about the writing process on that show? And you mentioned the long hours and how many other writers were in the room and what roles, the collaborative roles of that show.
That show was the second greatest job of my life. Breaking Bad being the first. X-Files and The Lone Gunman, which came later, were very close seconds. X-Files was a great job that taught me everything I know about writing for TV, or certainly everything I needed to know to run my own show. It was like going to film school all over again, except that, it was like going to film school, except I was getting paid to be there. And it was, we have much more of a writer's room, quote unquote, on Breaking Bad, I think because our show is so serialized. X-Files was very much a standalone show. There were the standalone episodes, the Monster of the Week episodes, if you will, and then there were the mythology episodes that were a little bit more somewhat serialized and ongoing, and they would be peppered in. You'd have a mythology episode every 5 or 6 or 7 episodes of standalone episodes. But being mostly a non-serialized show, there wasn't necessarily a group writer's room every day. Everyone would get together, a couple days a week and spend time in the writer's room together. But it was as much about checking in. Okay, what are you doing now? What are you working on? Well, I got this thing about this Aztec mummy. Oh, okay, all right. What about you? Well, I got this thing about a swimming pool that comes to life. Whatever. So everyone, it was Chris Carter at first. Chris, it was always his show. He was always running it. But then more and more, Frank Spotnitz, close friend, good friend of mine. Became more and more of a help to Chris in breaking the stories and John Scheiben. The three of us, Frank and John and I, as the seasons went by, kind of moved up in the ranks. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. But essentially, the writer's room was such that it was basically, Frank or Chris saying, "So what are you working on? Tell me about it. Pitch what you've got." And I'd pitch, the story of Pusher, a guy. What I got is a guy. He can suggest things to people. He can talk. He can say, wouldn't it be? Why don't you go throw yourself in front of that lawnmower? And then people go do it. Okay, that's interesting. All right. So what happens? How did Mulder and Scully get into the story? I don't know. I need some help with that. Okay. Well, what if? So it was an interesting process. It was kind of a little bit loosey-goosey at times, but always very helpful and creative and sharing of you'd come in with an idea, you'd get some help. If the idea was sound and sounded like something interesting enough that Chris thought we should pursue it, Chris or Frank and the guys, then they'd say, "What do you got?" "Well, I got this." "Okay, that sounds pretty good." "And I got this." "Well, maybe that needs some help. And I'm lacking some bit of connective tissue here." And he'd kind of throw it open to the room and kind of hammer it out. And then you'd go back and work on it some more by yourself. So the writer's room really, what most TV writers think of as a writer's room, really would kick in when we were in force on the X-Files, when we were on a serious deadline. And then we'd get together and really gang-bang together. We'd figure out, we'd knock out brick by brick, an episode of TV. And but I was mainly, I sort of became the rewrite guy on the X-Files. We all sort of had our areas of expertise, and in later years of the X-Files, there was a writer's room, and I wasn't in it that often because I'd be rewriting a script. I'd be writing an original, or perhaps tasked with rewriting somebody else's script, and meanwhile Frank would be in the writer's room and breaking stories, and John would be in the editing room and making sure that the episodes were edited properly and edited in that X-File way. And so we all there were divisions of labor as the show progressed.
Were there rules set forth by Carter on the show to the writers?
Chris was a great boss, and part of that was because there's a lot of reasons he's a great boss, but Chris didn't have rules so much as guidelines, but gosh, there were well, first and foremost, tell a good story. That's a rule. Tell an interesting story that sucks the audience in. Try to tell it from a point of view. Pick a point of view. Is it Mulder's point of view in this scene? Whose point of view? Whose eyes are we watching this scene through?
And it would change?
Yeah, I mean, a teaser, for instance, on the X-Files most likely would not have Mulder and Scully in it, although sometimes we did. Well, the thing I love about the X-Files and the thing I love about Chris was rules are made to be broken. So there were rules, kind of, but they were kind of made to be broken. But guidelines, if you will. A guideline was, whose eyes are we watching this episode through, or this scene through? A teaser in which a new character is introduced. If there's a woman, walking down a sidewalk at night with the fog around or whatever, I'm just making this up. You want to be inside her head when there's a shadow that passes along the wall and there's a creepy voice coming out of an alley. You want to be squarely inside that woman's head. It's just, and again, this is just writing 101, I guess, especially the scene I'm describing. But you don't want to be watching this at a unemotional, detached distance. You want to be in this woman. You want to put the audience in that woman's head, so we can all share that fear, that cathartic sort of fear. So that was a big guideline. You don't want to stand back and watch from a tableau position. From a proscenium kind of a view. And I say that from a directing point of view, but actually from a writing point of view too. Right from the page, from day one of the writing, Chris would want us to put ourselves as writers into the heads of the person who he would want us to think in terms of point of view. It was a very visual show. That was another guideline, if you will. Chris always said, what's the visual element in this episode? Even if it's an episode about, I'm trying to think of a good example. Gosh, I'm coming up dry. But Chris
Wasn't that monster one with the bug? What was that one?
There was an episode.
The vinyl called the Folie à Deux.
I'm pronouncing that wrong. Folie à Deux. Yeah, Folie à Deux, a French term meaning a madness shared by two. Yeah, that was an episode in which this guy who works in a call center thinks that his boss is some kind of monster who's sucking the souls out of his employees and turning them into zombies, which of course is we've all kind of felt that from time to time working at various jobs. But that show needed a visual element, which was to see through the crazy guy's eye. The guy, of course, in true X-Files fashion, does not turn out to be crazy at all. He's telling the truth, but he seems very crazy. He takes everybody hostage with a rifle. But you see through his eyes his boss turn into this creepy insectoid creature, and that was the visual element of that episode. And eventually Mulder sees the same thing. And so I love Chris for this. He's a very visual thinker and a visual storyteller. And to me, it's of course you need to be. This is motion pictures. Movies or TV, it's all motion pictures. You're telling a story through pictures. Dialogue is great. Dialogue is important and wonderful, and a well-turned phrase, a well-turned bit of dialogue is to be treasured and quoted, as the years go by. But I think what's really important in motion pictures is the face or the picture, the image. That our best moments on the X-Files were when, and our best moments on Breaking Bad, in fact, or when we can tell the audience something, we can tell them a story, we can make them feel something without words. And I really got a lot of that from Chris. I was probably more dialogue conscious before I met Chris and worked for him, but his constantly hammering in a very good-natured way. What are we looking at? What's the visual image? What's the thing? Because images you remember more than. At least his take on it, I think. Not to speak for him, but what I glean from that, my take on it is that we remember images sometimes better than we remember words. I don't know if that's true or not. It is for me anyway. But all of this held me in good stead, and these were, good guidelines Chris had. Another one was that I try to abide by now is that Chris, the way Chris did business was the best idea wins. You hear that a lot now. I hear that a lot in when I read interviews and stuff from folks in the business, and I feel like I don't think Chris invented that, but I in some weird way I give credit to Chris for that. I know there were great showrunners before Chris who abided by that rule, but quite often showrunners could be kind of autocratic and egomaniacal too, and want their idea to be the idea. And Chris was not that. Chris was always, I don't care whose idea it is. If the assistant pops in and says, "What if you did this?" then that's what we're going with. If it's the best idea, if it's the right idea. So, all good, not rules, if you will, but ways of doing business, good guidelines. Mm-hmm. So.
Now, with an episode like Folio 2,
that's good.
Thank you. Un peu
sounded good.
Did you have any input in constructing the visual element? I mean, did you, as a writer for that episode, say what it should look like, what you should see, what you shouldn't see?
The X-Files was very good about, probably to the point that a lot of the directors, sometimes directors probably got annoyed with us, but Chris's thing was put it all on the page. And so, yes, the short answer to your question is yes. I mean, if you were to read an X-Files script, or a Breaking Bad script for that matter, because everything we do in Breaking Bad, in some sense, in my mind, derives from the way I did it, the way I was taught to do it on the X-Files. But you read any of these scripts, and they are very dense with description, with scene description. Quite often, with an X-Files script, there was the way I would write them, the way Chris would write them. There would be blocks of description, and then some dialogue, and then more description. And so, yes, the short answer being, like, for instance, in that episode, I probably spent a paragraph or two at least at the point of the first description of what the monster looked like to describe what I thought the monster looked like. Now, at that point, you do your best as a writer, and folks like the makeup artist and the director and the cinematographer, if you're talking about the way the lighting should look, at some point, at least in a good-natured fashion, you're going to think, Jesus, what a kibitzer. Let me do my job here. But I think it was a good thing. Because then, like, for instance, my idea of the insect creature was not a tenth as good as what our wonderful makeup artist wound up coming up with. They came up with something that blew me away when I saw it and was just much better than what I had in my imagination. But it's a good foundation. It should start with the writing, versus a script where it's just, Hannibal crosses the Alps with his elephants. You make the audience, and the audience in this case is the craftsmen and the craftsmen and women, the crew people of the TV show, or the movie or whatever. Make them see it, bring it alive. Use your best tools as a writer, and take some time to describe it. Bring it alive in their minds as much as you can. Give as much detail as you can, without bogging down in detail, but give as much as you can, and then let them take it from there. So that was the short answer is yeah, I would kibitz as much as I could and try to describe what the damn lighting looked like, what the sound sounded like, what the this and that and the other. But then you got to let it go from there. Once in television production, you turn this in, and then the really talented craftspeople take it from there.
When you wrote a show, did someone else edit your script?
I was very lucky. You mean as someone take a pass through? Mm-hmm. I think it's the reason I love the X-Files experience so much. Soft Light, that first script I wrote, Chris and probably Howard Gordon and some of the folks there rewrote it, made it better, actually. Rewrote probably quite a substantial amount of it. And looking back, my first draft, which I have somewhere, the one that I wrote completely, probably would have cost like $30 or $40 million to produce as an hour of television. It was insane. It had this big ending that was like right out of some enormous feature, and they probably were laughing at themselves as they read it, and then they rewrote it and made it doable. But that really, I was very fortunate on the X-Files. That was really the only one that ever got rewritten. Chris, I just had the voices of the characters somehow, in my head, maybe because I was such a fan of the show, but I somehow, I don't say this lightly, I was very lucky. I was very fortunate in that the show just kind of clicked from the first time I saw it, and I got it. And I think because of that, I was able to write the voices. I was able to write the show, and I got plenty of good constructive notes from Chris and Frank and the guys, but I was sort of the rewrite guy. I wound up being the rewrite guy because I was the guy who kind of never got rewritten. And I was very, very proud of that. After that first episode, I was the guy who never got rewritten. You know, I'd do their notes, and I'd based on their verbal notes to me, I'd do passes through it and make it better myself. But I didn't get it wrestled away from me, and you know, it didn't run through anyone else's typewriter. And I was, not only was I very proud of that, it's probably a big part of the reason I stuck around for 7 years, because I'm enough of a control freak that would have sapped my will to go on if that had happened. So.
Now, that said, were there limits to what you could do? Were there limits to the violence you could show, or? Oh yeah,
I remember. We can get away with, God knows, we can get away with so much more in Breaking Bad. We had this wonderful lady. She's a very sweet lady. We liked her a lot. Linda Shimasuna, who was our broadcast standards and practices person on the show. And she was a very sweet lady. I don't know what happened to her. I liked her a lot. But it was not her job to make our lives tougher, but it just inadvertently worked out that way. And she was always very apologetic when she'd give us standards and practices notes. But I remember one that really to this day bugged me. It was weird. You could show so much blood and gore on the X-Files, but there were certain rules about, you know, I had a scene in that episode Pusher where Mulder and the bad guy are playing Russian roulette. And Linda said, you can't, on Fox, you're not allowed to show someone put a gun to their head because it's imitatable behavior. And I was like, what? They're playing Russian roulette. How the hell are we? Well, we got to really limit the amount of time they're holding a gun. We got to really. This is a big deal because people won't do this in network TV. And I'm like, and then after that, I'm seeing old episodes of like Ironside and stuff where people got guns to their own heads. I mean, they've been doing this for like 50 years in TV, putting guns to their own heads. But it was like Jesus. But that was a bit of a fight. And then, in an episode called Paper Hearts that I was very proud of, that the bad guy played by Tom Noonan in the very end of the episode gets shot in the head point blank by Mulder. If you haven't seen the episode, this guy has it coming in spades. He's like a terrible child molester and all this. But she wouldn't let us do an entry wound. And it was we could have a spatter of blood on the glass behind his head, but we couldn't have an entry wound in his forehead. She just thought that was too much. And it still bugs me to this day, to the point that I wish, I'd probably pay some money to have them go in and digitally put an entrance wound in there. Because Holly's, my girlfriend Holly, even her 90-some-year-old dad who was watching the episode called up later and said, I like the episode, but when that ball fella gets shot in the head at the end, I don't understand. Where was the bullet hole? So even he was like, onto that. So anyway. Yeah, so standards and practices is always kind of a bugaboo. But they were actually, they meant well. There's all a purpose behind it, so I guess. I don't know.
Were there different hats you had to wear when you were producing the show versus just being the writer later? Could you argue more?
I was not a good producer on the X-Files, in the sense that I was not, all I cared about was putting on the best show that we could put on. And I got to say, X-Files, I don't know that there'll ever be a situation like that again. It was like, what's the biblical equivalent? It was like, it's like the rivers were flowing with gold and honey and whatever. It was just like, there was so much goddamn money on that show. I mean, and that show was one of the first shows. Maybe the Simpsons, I guess, came first and is still turning a very, very tidy profit for the Fox Corporation. But it was the Simpsons and the X-Files. The X-Files at some point in the late 90s had made $1 billion for the studio and the network. And it was a money-making machine, and it was a phenomenon culturally and critically, and mainly culturally, I think. And to that end, we got away with, we get to blow up a railroad train. We get to build as I say I didn't have so much of a hand in these particular episodes, but there was an episode where they rented out a giant cold storage facility, filled it with real snow, and got it, it was way below freezing, and built a full-size conning tower of a nuclear submarine and put it on hydraulic jacks so that it would lower 6 feet, so that Mulder, it gets thrown off it by some alien bounty hunter, and he's lying in the snow, and the whole nuclear submarine starts to descend into the polar ice, leaving him stranded at the North Pole. It's like, of course, nowadays you could do a lot of this stuff digitally for less money, but it was unheard of at the time. It's probably will forever be unheard of. It was amazing, the kind of money we had.
We're going to take a break and change tapes.